Yes, thank you, Taco. I can certainly tell you more. I've been working with Nature Smart Cities to carry out the semi-structured interview program that's part of our application form, and that is contributing to an understanding of our business model. But we think it has a wider relevance beyond that to smaller cities generally looking at green infrastructure projects. And it would be interesting to know whether you recognise yourselves in some of the results of these interviews. Our study carried out 53 interviews in cities of less than 550,000 population. Those were undertaken with decision makers and officers working in green infrastructure, and they covered a wide range of areas. It was a 50-minute interview. So there's a great deal of material in the results, far more than I can possibly cover in the 20-minute session I have here. So I would encourage you to have a look at the report, which is available on the project website, and the address for that has already appeared and will appear again, no doubt, as we go through these presentations. So today I just want to focus on three of what I think are the key findings of this study. One is to do with the way in which smaller cities understand the concept of green infrastructure. The second is a ranking of the priorities and obstacles that small cities identify in relation to delivering the green infrastructure. And the third has to do with evidence and making the case for green infrastructure in a smaller city. So if we start with this one, the understanding of green infrastructure in a smaller city. The first thing to say is that there is no common understanding of green infrastructure. We asked our respondents what differentiates, as far as they're concerned, what differentiates green infrastructure from green space or planting. And the answers varied very widely. And this no common understanding means that when two people talk about green infrastructure together, they may not be sharing either the same terminology or the same interpretation of that terminology. But having said that, there were some common threads that came out through the interviews. And one of those was a recognition of the attribute of multifunctionality as it applies to green infrastructure. The idea that a GI installation can fulfill more than one purpose. It might be planned to do so. It might be planned that a recreation area also has a biodiversity role, for instance, but it might equally be unplanned. And we came across one instance where a small recreation area had completely failed as a recreation area. People just didn't use it, but it has transformed itself into an area of attractive to wildlife and had become more valuable to its community that way. Another attribute that was recognised was the idea of ecosystem services, although very few people actually use this term at all. But what they said, what they described as a dimension of green infrastructure could be understood as an ecosystem service. It could be classified in this way. So for instance, flood resilience or water management or whatever. And the third attribute that was recognised around green infrastructure was the idea of connectivity, the idea that different green elements link together, and the concept of a network of connected sites was also mentioned. Lille is actually taking this approach in relation to its own pilot project in Nature Smart Cities, and the installation that you can see in this picture is an example of what Lille is trying to do in densely built up areas, creating small installations that are quite small in themselves, but which collectively make up a much wider and much more powerful network. And the fourth attribute that people recognize strongly was impact, and particularly the impact of green infrastructure on people. Green infrastructure is very largely interpreted as being something that benefits people. It's anthropocentric, if you like. So having got the definition from the respondent, we asked the interviewee, would your decision maker recognise that description that you've just given? So these results that follow on this slide are not necessarily what decision makers themselves would actually say. These are the perceptions of the people who work for them. And they find a variety of levels of understanding, from excellent in some instances through to quite limited in other instances. But generally, it would be fair to say that decision makers are seen as less well informed than the officers who work for them. Generally seen as a bit behind the curve, needing help, needing encouragement, needing guidance from their officers. And the engagement of decision makers is affected in three different ways. Politically, there are sometimes trade-offs, for instance, in authorities that are run by coalition government. The decision maker for green infrastructure may not necessarily be in full control over the council's policy as a whole. We came across one instance, for example, where the decision maker for green infrastructure was making herself extremely popular by making some very popular green installations, but was losing credibility with her mayor, who was from another party and saw her as a bit of a challenge. There were practical implications regarding engagement. The realities of governing mean compromise, and in some instances, they mean dealing with councils that include climate change deniers among their governors. And the scale of smaller cities means that sometimes just one person or a very small team of people are charged with dealing with green infrastructure. So there's a limited practical capability to influence policy or projects. And there are operational challenges. Often responsibilities in local government are split between departments, split between aldermen, and green infrastructure is nothing if it's not integrated and holistic. So those splits of responsibilities make green infrastructure more difficult to achieve. And not all decision makers were that interested in working across organisational boundaries, according to the officers who work for them. There are some other dimensions of decision making that are worth noting. In the first place, inconsistency. There are several respondents who said that their decision makers or their council as a corporate whole says one thing but does another. So, for instance, one council I'm aware of has a climate change strategy, which it makes a fair bit of noise about, but it nevertheless promotes car-friendly policies and makes car-friendly decisions when it actually comes down to it. One of the respondents in that council noted that nobody in this council ever travels by bus. There are several councils where the officers describe them as being cost-led or cost-driven. It's all about the money in these places. So projects that attract external funding are welcomed, and they appeal more than those that have to be funded locally. But these councils also tend to favour approaches where the costs can be calculated and defended with confidence. And that often rules out green approaches where the costs and returns are more speculative and more difficult to argue. Some of these authorities are risk averse. They're averse to risks in relation to public money, and they're also averse to risks in terms of public opinion. And that means they avoid confrontations in these areas rather than addressing them directly. And there's a certain amount of short-termism going on here too. The electoral cycle means that elected representatives at least want quick results, and they want visibility. The ideal is a photo opportunity next to a green infrastructure installation with local children who've helped create it. And that's true not just for newly elected councillors, aldermen, but even for those who've been in office for a long time. And there's also a certain narrow focus. The decision makers in smaller councils don't necessarily see beyond the immediately visible impact to the more abstract concepts that green infrastructure might be addressing. So they won't see, they'll see the trees, but they won't see the carbon capture. They don't see the opportunities that a green infrastructure might embrace with a wider lens. So an active travel project might be supported, but the biodiversity possibilities that might lie within such a project are not explored nearly as vigorously. So moving on to the ranking of priorities and obstacles. What are the priority outcomes being sought in smaller cities when they look at GI project proposals? Well, the methodology behind this chart is explained in the report, and I don't really have time to go into it now, but essentially people selected cards and we gave the way they selected them, we assigned a score to them, depending on how big a priority that card represented. And you can see here there's a range of answers on the 12 options that people were given. Anything that scores over 1 could be seen as a fairly high priority, and anything over 1.5 is definitely a high priority. Anything that scores below 1, well, it's arguable that it's a priority. So the highest priority overall is an attractive place to live, which is very rarely the reason why you would create a green infrastructure project, but there it is. And it's quite a long way ahead of the other priorities that these authorities are looking to achieve. Public health is up there, and so is active travel. And in fairness, active travel would probably be even higher if the Netherlands wasn't so far advanced with that already. And opportunities for recreation and weather resilience all score pretty well on this ranking. But things like the heat island effect, carbon capture, increased land and property values, and reducing noise pollution don't really emerge very strongly at all. On an attractive place to live, 32 people placed that, out of my 53, 32 people placed that as a high priority in their city. So there's quite a high degree of agreement that this is what the smaller city is really looking for. And if we take a step back from those results and think about them, attractiveness might be seen as quite a shallow kind of ambition. We don't normally do green infrastructure just to make the place look nice, and it isn't normally the main reason we would advance for promoting a green infrastructure idea. The advantage, though, of having attractiveness as such a high priority is that green infrastructure is inherently attractive. It's usually more attractive than the grey alternative. And it can deliver other benefits in terms of attracting or retaining residents, economic benefits in areas like tourism or business investment, and environmentally, such as flood alleviation and so on. So although these other benefits might be important and might be the real reason why you're doing this project, it's worth noting that attractiveness is a big selling point when it comes to the decision making. It was interesting that health, which came second in that chart, is highly rated, but contributing factors that support public health, like pollution, noise pollution, and so on, are not so highly rated. This might raise questions about commitment. It might raise questions about the understanding of how pollution, for instance, might affect air quality and contribute to new onset asthma and so on. When people were talking about resilience in this ranking, they were usually focusing on flooding, either stormwater flooding or tidal inundation. There was no real focus at all on drought, and only in those cities that have experienced heat stress was heat stress mentioned. What's also noticeable is that things that come up to the top of that ranking are priorities that are visible, tangible, and immediate. These are things that can be delivered in the short term that impact highly on the livability of an area and that are visible. and recognisable. The politicians can see them and the public can see them. The difference is there to be observed. Now, we did a similar sort of exercise on the obstacles that hinder the development of green infrastructure. And again, anything over 1 here, that red line on the chart, is a serious obstacle. The results around the red line level are obstacles that might be overcome. They exist, but they might well be negotiable. And the ones at the right-hand end of the chart are, in reducing order, less of an issue. So the biggest obstacle of all, which you might have predicted would be funding, isn't in fact funding. It's conflicting priorities within the local authority itself. Funding comes second, and it comes second because although it's a big problem in a lot of authorities, there are 1 or 2 that are actually quite wealthy and don't have problems with raising finance for green infrastructure. Also up there as significant obstacles are convincing developers that green is the right way to go and proving the value of green infrastructure. And proving the value is, of course, the main focus of our project. At the right-hand end, the things that are not really problematic in a big way: partnership with other organisations, public scepticism, the public is largely on side with this, national policy on green infrastructure, which is either mildly supportive or completely benign, as far as I can see, and partnership with other departments. So some observations on these obstacles. The conflicts over priorities focus on housing and highways. These are the departments that it's difficult to penetrate with green ideas. They tend to be in their own departments, and the green has to fight its way in. Planning regimes might be the first line of defence against developers, but have proved not always to be effective. If housing is a real priority, it will be given a priority. Proving value is too difficult at the moment. Hopefully our business model will do something about that. And capacity issues within the local authority, again, as I've said, it's often the case that green is managed by just 1 or 2 people within the authority, and they have to break down the internal walls to be heard. And it was very interesting that partnership with other departments is actually more difficult than partnership with outside bodies. It can be hard to break down those internal divisions, those structural problems that get in the way. So finally, moving on to making the case for green infrastructure, we looked at 2 different types of evidence. Although environmental evidence comes out strongest here, all 3 types of evidence on this slide clearly have an influential role. And I wouldn't say that this means that you should emphasize the environmental benefit as opposed to stressing the other 2. But when it comes to whether the evidence is of direct benefit to people, indirect benefit to people, or more generally to the environment and the planet as a whole, there's no question. Projects that provide direct benefit to people are what decision makers are looking for. These are the projects that are visible, immediate, understood, and best provide the best possibility of photo opportunities. As to financial evidence, it isn't always about cost, but sometimes it is. Cost is important. And the green-grey choice may be determined by cost and by confidence in the green alternative, which is probably unproven, as against the grey alternative, which the council might well have done before. Cost-benefit analysis is what's usually offered here, and it's usually limited to the capital cost and the period of payback of which that cost will be amortized. There's no monetization, really, of ecosystem services. 1 or 2 councils use rule of thumb calculations, such as assigning a notional value to each property that's protected from flooding. But actually, there's very little being done in this area at the moment, and this is another area where our business model might help. There's an increasing need for reliable data to forecast ecosystem service performance and gains. There's limited access to this data. One authority simply looks it up on the internet and relies on what that tells it. But even then, data handling skills, GIS skills, are quite limited in smaller authorities. They need support in this area. It means that they tend to use oversimplified data and to rely on data collected for other purposes. And there's very little monitoring. Authorities are simply too busy. So the experience of delivering GI and achieving measurable change doesn't feed back into the decision-making process for the next time round. You can't actually use in your business proposition, unless you've collected the data on the earlier project that you did, you can't use that data to support another example of it. So when it comes to the business model and the essentials that, that a tool needs to have, we think there are three. One is it has to be usable. It has to be within the intellectual and time availability of a person working in a smaller authority, which is often quite limited. So there has to be no steep learning curve, easily sourced input data, and a limited amount of specialist knowledge that's needed. It has to be comprehensive. There are loads of tools out there, but most of them simply measure one ecosystem service. They don't cover the range, and GI is nothing if it's not multifunctional. So it's offering a whole range of services that can all be brought into play as part of the argument in support of the project. And it has to inspire confidence. Decision makers need not only to be confident in the data they're being given, they need to be confident enough to be able to argue their case when it's challenged in cabinet. So a tool that's in wider use, or a tool that's used by a city that has an established reputation for green infrastructure, and a presentation that looks professional, looks the part, these all inspire confidence and will help to make the case in a sort of underground kind of way. So that's what we're looking for our business model. And you can find out more about this very interesting survey by visiting the address that's on the screen now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. That's really excellent stuff and very interesting. In fact, so interesting that before we share a few questions with you, we would like to hear from all the participants to see, not to run the whole survey by them in the same detailed level as you did, Phil, because I hear it would take 50 minutes or 53 minutes even. But let's have a poll number 3, please, to find out whether or not our participants recognize the priorities and obstacles in, let's say, the level of importance or non-importance in the same way that Phil has found them in his research in this series of interviews. So please, to the best of your knowledge, fill out the poll and see if you think, yes, the priorities and issues are probably similar to some extent, but there might be differences, or no, I don't recognize this at all. And a few of you notified us that you cannot participate in the polls. Maybe you want to submit your answer in the chat so that we can see whether or not with a yes or a no you recognize the findings of Phil's research. So we will leave that poll there for a few minutes, and in the meanwhile, Phil, I would like to ask you one of the questions that we got from the audience related to the specific factors that are in play. I noticed that at least in the obstacles bit, you referenced to national policies, and they were not the biggest of obstacles. But the question here is, did you try to find out whether green infrastructures are seen as something that helps to improve compliance with mainly environmental legislation?
Well, there are various motivations for using green infrastructure. The reason national policies come fairly low down that list is because local authorities don't do green infrastructure so as to comply with national priorities. In the European Union, and I think probably in the Netherlands in particular, the national policy largely hands the whole of the responsibility for environmental enhancement over to local authority. There are national frameworks, but they're largely benign. They don't make particularly demanding direct requests, and local authorities are free to develop as they see fit, as long as they sit within that fairly broadly defined framework. There was an important difference between the UK and the European Union as regards biodiversity. In planning policy in the UK, there's a move towards net biodiversity gain from development, whereas in the European Union, it's no net loss of biodiversity from a development. That could over time become quite an important difference, and I'm a little mystified as to why the European Union doesn't take a slightly stronger line on biodiversity. It's fairly rare for the UK to be ahead of the European Union on anything that we share together, and yet we seem to be asking more of local authorities than our European colleagues are.
So there, you even implicitly make the case for continued learning across the two sides of the North Sea, even after January 1st, because clearly there's still a lot to also to learn and inspire each other when it comes to this particular aspect of biodiversity ambitions, if you like.
Well, and I think in other areas too, Taco, one of the side aims of this project is to create a knowledge network that continues to share even after our formal relationship has changed. I think there's still huge potential for us to learn from one another.
Well, that's an important thought that we should keep with us for the rest of the day and longer, I hope. Maybe, Lean, if you could show us the results of the poll that we just launched and see how recognizable Phil's research results are to the participants.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think this is what you were hoping to see, Phil, no?
Well, it's obviously not a scientific piece of research, but it does provide some support for the message that I've just tried to communicate.
Yeah.
And it suggests then that the rest of the report and the discussion of those priorities and obstacles might well be of interest and of relevance to the people who are kind enough to watch this presentation. So I would encourage you to look at the full report and get the full benefit of the research work that's been done.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Phil, and for presenting your report. You know, participants, where you can find more information, and we will no doubt also resend you all the links shortly after this seminar. So you will be able to look into that in more detail. Thanks very much, Phil.